Picture a desert where hot wind blows sand across an endless, silent expanse. Yet this place was once the most powerful city on earth, home to millions of people, palaces gleaming with gold, and a king whose command reached for thousands of miles. This is the story of Assyria, the ancient Mesopotamian empire that rose around the modern Iraqi cities of Mosul and Tikrit to become the world's first military superpower, and then collapsed so completely that for centuries, people forgot its name ever existed. The story begins on the banks of the Tigris River, where a small town called Ashur was founded thousands of years ago. At first it was nothing more than a trading post, a modest cluster of mud houses, date palms and boats drifting along the riverbank. But over time the town grew wealthy, sitting as it did on trade routes carrying copper, tin, grain, and precious stones. Rich families began burying treasure beneath their homes, gold, silver, and prized stones like lapis lazuli. The city eventually built around 34 temples, each dedicated to a different god: a sun god, a moon god, a storm god, a goddess of love and war. And then, as was common for major cities of that era, the town created its own patron deity named Ashur, after the city itself. That same god, Ashur, would go on to become the identity of an entire nation, a people who called themselves the Ashuri, known to history as the Assyrians. Assyria's early centuries were difficult ones. This small state repeatedly fell under the control of larger neighbors, sometimes Babylon, sometimes the Mitanni, sometimes the Hittite Empire. Each time, Assyria would gain a brief spell of independence, build up its strength, and then be crushed by some larger rival. This cycle continued for roughly 2,000 years. Then came the period history calls the Bronze Age collapse, roughly 1200 to 1150 BC, when the entire Mediterranean world was engulfed in a mysterious wave of destruction. Enigmatic raiders known as the Sea Peoples wiped out kingdom after kingdom, famine spread, and one civilization after another crumbled to the ground. Only two major civilizations survived this catastrophe: Egypt and Assyria. Assyria survived because it knew when to pull back from its far-flung territories in time, focusing instead purely on defending its core trade routes. After this crisis, Assyria possessed something the rest of the world lacked: a disciplined army, iron, now 10 times more common than copper, and a royal dynasty whose rule had endured unbroken for centuries. This is where Assyria's real story begins, as one capable, ambitious king after another took the throne and transformed this small territory into the greatest power on earth. Tiglath-Pileser I led his army on campaigns in every direction, reaching the Mediterranean Sea for the first time, a remarkable feat for a kingdom born in dry desert terrain. It's said that the first time he boarded a ship, he claimed to have hunted a strange sea creature he called a sea horse, possibly a dolphin or a whale. He was followed by Adad-nirari II, under whose reign Assyrian scribes began recording history with such precision that modern historians can date year-by-year events from this period with confidence. But the true revolution came under Ashurnasirpal II, a king whose brutality and ruthless methods are still notorious in history today. He crushed rebellions with such severity that his enemies trembled at the mere mention of his name. Yet alongside this cruelty, he also built magnificent palaces of cedar and cypress wood, adorned with gold, silver, and ivory. After Ashurnasirpal, his son Shalmaneser III took the throne and claimed an army of 120,000 soldiers, at a time when the entire world's population was estimated at only about 50 million. But this army was made up of farmers who returned home each year at harvest time, meaning it was a weak, seasonal fighting force. Rebellions continued, and eventually Shalmaneser's own son rose up against him, drawing 27 cities, including Ashur itself, into revolt. This civil war shattered Assyria's military strength, and most of its conquered territories broke free. It became clear that if Assyria was to build a lasting empire, something fundamental had to change. Here history introduces a new name, Tiglath-Pileser III, who took his name after the great king who had reached the sea centuries earlier. This king completely transformed the army, creating, for the first time, a permanent standing force rather than one limited to the campaign season. He turned the army's corps into a professional, well-armed corps, supplementing it with infantry drawn from conquered territories. Alongside this, he created a dedicated engineering corps capable of building bridges, digging tunnels, and cutting roads through mountains, advances the Roman army wouldn't match for another 7 centuries. Iron production was expanded, and now every soldier carried an iron sword, an iron helmet, and iron armor. The results were immediate. Within 2 years, the kingdom of Urartu was defeated. Then the Syrian city of Arpad was placed under a 3-year siege, something the old seasonal army could never have sustained. When the city finally fell, Tiglath-Pileser sent a clear message to the world. A new era had begun. During this same period, Assyria also seized control of the great, ancient, sacred city of Babylon, and its flag flew across the entire Fertile Crescent, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. Next came the reign of Sargon II, whose dynasty, the Sargonid kings, would rule for 3 generations and mark both the empire's greatest peak and its eventual downfall. Sargon's son Sennacherib faced rebellious territories early in his reign but crushed them decisively. During his rule, the Judean king Hezekiah also rose in defiance of Assyria, prompting the Assyrian army to besiege and capture the city of Lachish in Judea, a campaign still depicted on the walls of Sennacherib's palace today. The Assyrian army advanced as far as Jerusalem, but for reasons that remain unclear, possibly plague, the army withdrew, and Jerusalem was spared. But Sennacherib's most consequential decision was the destruction of Babylon. Babylon was Mesopotamia's oldest and most sacred city, and when Sennacherib razed it completely after a rebellion, tearing down its walls, temples, and ziggurat, outrage spread across the ancient world. It was one of the acts that even the Assyrians themselves found hard to accept. Perhaps because of this, Sennacherib changed course in his final years, abandoning warfare for building projects. He made Nineveh his capital, constructing magnificent palaces and gardens there, and some believe his gardens may actually be the famous Hanging Gardens, usually attributed to Babylon. After Sennacherib's death, a bitter succession struggle broke out among his sons. 2 brothers, Uredd-Melissu and Esarhaddon, fought over the throne, and when Sennacherib named his younger son Esarhaddon as heir, the other brothers were enraged. Eventually, Sennacherib himself was murdered by his own son Uredd-Melissu while worshipping in a temple. The news spread across the ancient world. Esarhaddon quickly gathered an army to confront his rebellious brothers, but before battle could even begin, their own troops abandoned them, since no one wished to fight for the men who had murdered their king. Esarhaddon entered Nineveh without a major battle and took the throne, but the episode changed him permanently. He spent the rest of his life anxious and fearful, constantly consulting oracles about his future. Esarhaddon had Babylon rebuilt, hoping old wrongs might be undone, but his health declined steadily, showing symptoms that today we might attribute to depression or some physical illness. Before his death, he made an unusual decision. He divided his empire in 2. One son, Ashurbanipal, would rule the entire Assyrian empire from Nineveh, while another son, Shamash-Shumukin, would become king of Babylon. It was a beautiful vision, 2 brothers ruling 2 great cities together, but it soon collapsed into civil war. Ashurbanipal's reign is considered Assyria's most glorious period. Under him, Assyria was the largest empire on earth, and Nineveh was perhaps the largest city on the planet at the time. Ashurbanipal himself was an unusual figure, possibly the first Assyrian king who could read and write, since he had originally been trained for temple service before taking the throne. He took great pride in this skill and built the world's first library, gathering clay tablets on every subject, around 30,000 tablets in total, including the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, which survives today largely thanks to this very collection. Yet even at this peak of power, the seeds of ruin had already been sown. Ashurbanipal's brother, King Shamash-Shum of Babylon, was unhappy with his position. He was king in name only, while real authority still flowed from Nineveh. He secretly reached out to the kingdom of Elam and prepared a major rebellion. When the revolt broke out, Ashurbanipal was deeply shaken by his own brother's betrayal. He immediately sent his army to besiege Babylon, a siege that lasted 4 years. Famine spread through the city, and when it finally fell, Shamash-Shum died in a fire. Ashurbanipal then turned his fury toward Elam, launching a campaign meant to erase it from the map entirely. Elam's capital, Susa, was destroyed, its temples torn down, and the tombs of its ancient kings were dug up, their bones scattered. But even in this moment of triumph, the seeds of Assyria's destruction had already been planted. As Elam fell, a new and powerful group rose in its place, the Medes, from northwestern Iran. Until then, Elam had kept their ambitions in check, but that barrier no longer existed. At the same time, the climate itself was shifting. Analysis of stalagmites shows that a prolonged drought had begun in Assyria's northern territories, likely undermining the empire's economic foundations. After Ashurbanipal's death, the final years of which remain undocumented, as though he himself vanished into the folds of history, Assyria descended into chaos. Rebellions broke out everywhere. Seizing the opportunity, the Medes launched a sudden attack in 616 BC and captured Ashur, Assyria's oldest city. The first time in centuries an Assyrian city had fallen to an enemy. The news spread like wildfire across the ancient world. A new, obscure Babylonian king, Nabopolassar, who called himself the son of a nobody, allied with the Medes, and their combined forces marched on Nineveh. After 2 years of war, in 612 BC, the combined Median and Babylonian armies reached the walls of Nineveh. A 3-month siege followed, and the city finally fell. The Assyrian king Sin-Shar-Rishkun died in battle, and the city was looted and burned. Even today, excavations at Nineveh uncover skeletal remains bearing witness to that battle, soldiers and horses who fell where they stood, buried in silence for thousands of years. The event is also recorded in Jewish scripture, where Nineveh's destruction is presented as divine justice, an empire that had wronged so many others that the world finally united to bring it down. 2 years later, in 610 BC, the last remnants of the Assyrian army made a final stand at Haran before being wiped out, and thus an empire that had ruled over a vast stretch of the world for centuries was folded forever into the pages of history. Cities that once held millions of people had their ruins buried beneath desert sand. The ceilings of Nineveh's royal palaces collapsed years later, grass grew in streets once walked by kings, and wild animals came to live in halls that had once been filled with courtiers. Centuries later, when the Greek soldier and writer Xenophon marched through the region with his army, he had no idea what these cities were. He only knew they were the ruins of some great civilization, whose very names had faded from human memory. Such was the story of Assyria, an empire that rose to become the world's greatest power through its military might, its harshness, and its lust for domination, but whose very brutality eventually caused its own downfall, because the very peoples it had oppressed for so long eventually united to bring about its end. This story reminds us that no empire, however powerful, lasts forever, and that the cruelty inflicted on others often comes back, one day, to knock on its own door.